I was sitting on the cracked asphalt of a Denny's parking lot, staring at a Chase Bank app that read exactly $34.12. My fiancée of 3 years had just changed the apartment locks, moved her boss into our bedroom, and tossed my life into a pile of black hefty bags. In a moment of pure, blinding desperation, I took 30 of those last dollars and bet them on a blind storage unit auction on my phone. What I thought was a locker full of moldy cardboard and rusted junk turned out to be the burial ground of a multi-million-dollar secret. A secret that would not only rewrite my entire life, but put a terrifying target squarely on my back. The rain in Bakersfield, California, doesn't usually hit hard, but that Tuesday, it felt like the sky was trying to drown me. I sat in the driver's seat of my 1998 Ford Ranger, the heater blowing lukewarm, metallic-smelling air, and watched the water bead on the windshield. 2 hours earlier, I had come home from a grueling 12-hour shift at the logistics warehouse. I expected to find Anna, my fiancée, cooking dinner or watching Netflix on the couch we had picked out together at IKEA. Instead, I found my key wouldn't turn in the deadbolt. When I knocked, the door was answered not by Anna, but by Derek, the regional manager at the real estate firm where she worked. He was wearing my bathrobe. Anna appeared behind him, her expression a chilling mix of annoyance and apathy. There was no tearful confession, no dramatic argument, just cold, hard logistics. "The lease is in my name, Caleb," she had said, her voice completely steady, crossing her arms over her chest. "I've been unhappy for months. Derek and I are, well, we're moving forward. I packed your things. They're by the dumpsters in the alley." I had stood there, the rain soaking through my uniform, completely paralyzed. I had paid the deposit on that apartment. I had transferred half my paycheck into our joint Bank of America account every 2 weeks for 3 years. But when I checked the app standing right there on the welcome mat, the joint savings account was zeroed out. She had transferred it all into a private account. Because her name was the primary on the lease and the bank account, the police, who I foolishly called in a state of panic, told me it was a civil matter. They told me I had to leave the premises. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and in the span of 30 minutes, I had lost the woman I loved, my home, and my entire life savings. I drove to the alleyway behind our complex. 3 heavy-duty garbage bags sat next to a greasy dumpster. Inside were my clothes, a few framed photos with the glass shattered, and my work boots. Everything else, the television, the furniture, the vintage guitar my grandfather left me, was locked inside that apartment. I pulled into a nearby Denny's parking lot to assess the damage. My personal checking account at Chase had $34.12 left in it. Payday wasn't for another 9 days. I had a quarter tank of gas. My stomach growled loudly, but I couldn't even justify spending $5 on a Grand Slam burger. I was 30 years old, homeless, and effectively broke. The first night in the truck was a nightmare. The cold seeped through the thin metal of the Ford's doors. I tossed and turned on the cramped bench seat, wrapping myself in whatever clothes I had salvaged from the trash bags. Anger, humiliation, and terror fought a war in my chest. I had done everything right. I had worked hard, stayed loyal, and planned for a future. Now, I was a statistical cliché. The guy who lost it all to a cheating partner and a loophole in a lease agreement. By morning, the rain had stopped, replaced by a glaring, blinding California sun that turned the inside of my truck into a greenhouse. I woke up with a stiff neck and a desperate need for a shower. I walked into the Denny's, washed my face in the restroom sink, and bought a single 99-cent black coffee just so they wouldn't kick me out. Sitting in a sticky vinyl booth, I connected to the restaurant's free Wi-Fi. I needed a miracle. I scrolled through job boards, looking for day labor or anything that paid under the table. Nothing. Then, out of pure mindless habit, I opened an app I had downloaded months ago but rarely used, Storage Treasures. I used to watch those reality TV shows about storage auctions with my dad. It was a guilty pleasure. The app showed local storage units that were currently up for blind auction because the owners had defaulted on their rent. Usually, they went for hundreds or thousands of dollars. But as I scrolled, one listing caught my eye. It was at a place called Sunbelt Self-Storage, located off the dusty industrial stretch of Rosedale Highway. The auction was ending in exactly 12 minutes. The current bid was $10. I clicked on the listing. The facility had provided 3 blurry, low-resolution photos taken from the threshold of the open unit. It was a small 5x5 locker. Inside, it looked like absolute garbage. There was a stained, yellowing mattress leaning against the corrugated metal wall. On the floor sat a pile of collapsed, water-damaged cardboard boxes, some cheap plastic lawn chairs, and a ripped blue tarp covering a shapeless lump in the back corner. It was junk. It was the definition of a disposal fee waiting to happen. Nobody was bidding on it because it would cost more in dump fees to clear it out than the items inside were worth. But I was staring at that blue tarp in the back corner. I had $34.12. If I bought food, the money would be gone by tomorrow, and I'd still be homeless. If I bought gas, I could drive a little further. But to where? I was in a manic state, driven by the kind of reckless abandon that only comes when you literally have nothing left to lose. My thumb hovered over the screen. The timer ticked down. 2 minutes remaining. Screw it, I muttered to myself. I typed in a maximum bid of $30 and hit submit. The screen buffered for what felt like an eternity. The little loading circle spun and spun, mocking my terrible internet connection. Finally, a green banner flashed across the top of my cracked iPhone 11 screen. Congratulations, you have won this auction. My heart did a strange, hollow flutter. I had just spent my last $30 on a locker full of garbage. The app instructed me that I had 24 hours to go to the facility, pay the winning bid in cash, and put my own padlock on the unit. Furthermore, I had exactly 48 hours to completely empty the unit and sweep it clean, or I would be hit with a $150 cleaning fee, a fee I absolutely could not pay. I drained the dregs of my cold coffee, walked out to my truck, and fired up the engine. The drive to Sunbelt Self-Storage took 20 minutes. The facility was a sprawling, depressing compound of faded orange metal doors surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. It sat next to an abandoned tire shop and a stretch of dead grass. I pulled into the front office parking lot. The office itself smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine cleaner. Behind a plexiglass window sat the manager, a heavy-set guy in his 50s wearing a stained polo shirt with the name Stan embroidered on the chest. He didn't look up from his iPad when I walked in. "I won an auction online," I said, my voice sounding rough and dry. "Unit 402. Stan sighed heavily, finally looking up. He had dark circles under his eyes and an expression that suggested he hated everyone he interacted with. "Name?" "Caleb Hayes." He typed something into his ancient desktop computer. "All right, Hayes. $30, plus a $50 cleaning deposit, fully refundable when you leave the unit broom swept by Thursday at noon." My stomach dropped. $50. I didn't have $50. I didn't even have $5. The app didn't say anything about a cash deposit. I panicked, my voice rising slightly. It just said the cleaning fee would be charged to my card if I didn't empty it. "Read the fine print, kid," Stan said, pointing a thick finger at a faded sign taped to the plexiglass. "All auction winners must provide a $50 cash deposit. No deposit, no access, and if you forfeit, I ban your account from the platform." I felt the blood rushing to my ears. I had just thrown away my last $30 for nothing. I was about to lose the unit and the money. I stared at Stan, and then, completely unprompted, my eyes welled up. It wasn't just the unit. It was Anna. It was the apartment. It was the fact that I was sleeping in a Ford Ranger. The dam finally broke. "Look, man," I said, my voice cracking, gripping the edge of the counter. "I got kicked out of my house yesterday. My fiancé took everything. I slept in a Walmart parking lot. I have exactly $34.12 to my name. If you don't let me into that unit, I lose my last $30. Please. I promise you, I will leave that concrete floor so clean you could eat off it. Just, please give me a break. Stan stared at me. The silence in the office was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. For a long moment, I thought he was going to tell me to get out, but his eyes softened, just a fraction. He looked at my rumpled work uniform, my bloodshot eyes, and the sheer desperation radiating off me. He sighed, a long, ragged sound, and pulled a ring of keys from his belt. I'm waiving the deposit in the system, Stan muttered, not looking me in the eye. But if there's so much as a single piece of cardboard left in that unit by Thursday at noon, I will personally hunt you down. $30, cash. I practically shoved the 3 $10 bills under the glass. Thank you. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet, Stan grunted, printing a receipt. Unit 402 is a nightmare. Guy stopped paying rent 3 years ago. We finally got around to auctioning it because the smell was starting to bother the unit next door. Good luck. You're going to need it. He handed me a gate code and a cheap brass padlock. I got back in my truck and drove through the metal gates, my tires crunching over the gravel. The facility was arranged in long, narrow rows. It felt like a maze. I finally found the 400 block, parked my truck in front of the faded orange door marked 402, and killed the engine. I stepped out into the oppressive heat. The unit had a red plastic tag on the latch, indicating it was legally mine. I ripped the tag off, grabbed the metal handle, and threw my weight into it. The roll-up door screamed in protest, metal grinding against ungreased metal, before violently sliding up into the ceiling. A wave of hot, stagnant air hit me squarely in the face. Stan wasn't kidding about the smell. It was a pungent, suffocating mixture of mildew, dead rodents, and something sharply chemical, like old battery acid. I covered my nose and mouth with my shirt and stepped into the dim 5x5 concrete box. It was worse than the pictures. Up close, the mattress was completely rotted out, springs poking through the stained fabric. The cardboard boxes had collapsed onto themselves, turning into mushy, unidentifiable blocks of pulp. I stood there in the stifling heat, looking at the mountain of literal garbage I had just traded my last meals for. I fell to my knees right there on the concrete, burying my face in my dirty hands. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive my truck into a bridge. I had been an idiot. I had gambled my last lifeline on a fantasy. Okay, I whispered to myself, trying to slow my racing heart. Okay, you have to clean it out anyway. Let's just get it over with. I backed my truck right up to the door, lowered the tailgate, and got to work. For the first 2 hours, it was nothing but back-breaking, soul-crushing labor. The temperature outside was pushing 95 degrees, but inside the corrugated metal box, it felt like an oven. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes, as I dragged the heavy, rotting mattress out and threw it into the bed of my truck. A family of dead mice cascaded out of a hole in the fabric, making me gag. Next came the boxes. They were filled with absolute junk, rusty kitchen utensils, broken Tupperware, yellowing stacks of 1990s Cosmopolitan magazines fused together by moisture, and a collection of cheap, shattered ceramic figurines. Every item I tossed into my truck bed felt like another nail in my coffin. I was basically providing free labor for Sunbelt Self-Storage, acting as their personal garbage man. By the time I reached the back corner of the unit, my hands were blistered, my back was screaming, and I was dangerously dehydrated. Only the blue tarp remained. The tarp was thick, coated in years of undisturbed dust, and it was covering something bulky on the floor. I grabbed the edge of the plastic, holding my breath, fully expecting to uncover an old refrigerator or a pile of moldy clothes. I yanked it back. A cloud of dust exploded into the air, forcing me to step back and cough violently. When the air finally cleared, I wiped my stinging eyes and looked down. Sitting on the concrete floor, completely isolated from the rotten ruin of the rest of the unit, was a large, heavy-duty military Pelican case. It was olive green, thick reinforced plastic, heavily ribbed and completely waterproof. Unlike everything else in the locker, it wasn't covered in mold. It looked like it had been placed there deliberately, shielded by the tarp. My heart did a strange little stutter. I wiped my sweaty palms on my jeans and knelt beside it. The case was heavy, at least 40 pounds. It had 2 heavy-duty steel latches on the front, and through the center hasp hung a thick, stainless steel master lock. Suddenly, my fatigue vanished. The adrenaline that had abandoned me earlier came rushing back with a vengeance. You don't put garbage in a waterproof, lockable, $300 Pelican case. You put valuables in there. You put things you want to survive a flood, a fire, or a long passage of time. I ran out to my truck, my hands shaking, and grabbed a rusty tire iron from behind the driver's seat. I hurried back into the unit, wedged the flat, wedged end of the iron into the loop of the master lock, and threw all my body weight into it. The metal groaned. I adjusted my grip, planted my boots on the concrete floor, and heaved upward with a guttural yell. With a sharp crack, the steel loop snapped. The lock clattered uselessly to the floor. I dropped the tire iron. My breathing was ragged. I slowly undid the 2 steel latches. Click, click. I lifted the heavy lid. The inside of the case was lined with custom-cut, high-density black foam, and nestled perfectly inside those precise cutouts were 3 distinct items. The first was a camera. But not just any camera. Even with my limited knowledge, I knew what I was looking at. It was a vintage Leica M3, a gorgeous piece of mid-century German engineering, heavy with brass and chrome. Attached to it was a thick, braided leather strap. Tucked neatly into the foam beside the camera were 6 tightly sealed silver aluminum canisters of undeveloped 35mm film. The second item was a heavy, dark green leather ledger. It looked like the kind of account book an accountant would use in the 1970s. It was held shut by a dry, cracked rubber band. But it was the third item that made my blood run cold. It was a heavy, solid brass key. It was longer than a standard house key, with complex, jagged teeth and a square head. Stamped into the brass was a sequence of numbers, BX-704. And beneath the numbers, embossed clearly in the metal, was the logo for Wells Fargo Bank. Attached to the key was a small manila tag. I picked up the camera first. It was surprisingly heavy, feeling like a solid block of metal. I turned it over in my hands. The lens was pristine. But as I flipped it, I noticed something engraved on the bottom plate. It wasn't a serial number. It was a name, etched deeply into the brass in elegant cursive script. Harrison Whitmore. I dropped the camera back into the foam as if it had burned me. I stumbled backward, hitting my shoulders against the hot metal wall of the storage unit. Anybody who grew up in the Central Valley of California knew the name Harrison Whitmore. He was a local legend, a ruthless real estate tycoon who essentially owned half of the commercial properties in the county during the 80s and 90s. He was notorious for his aggressive tactics, his massive wealth, and his sudden, highly publicized downfall. In 2018, Whitmore's empire abruptly collapsed amidst a massive federal investigation into money laundering and tax evasion. The FBI raided his massive estate. But before they could arrest him, Harrison Whitmore vanished, completely disappeared. The official narrative was that he fled the country, penniless and disgraced, leaving his properties to be seized by the banks. The media circus lasted for months, but he was never found. And now, I was standing in a $30 abandoned storage unit, staring at a camera with his name on it, a ledger, and a safe deposit key. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely grab the ledger. I snapped the brittle rubber band, opening the heavy cover. The pages were filled with columns of neat, handwritten numbers and dates stretching back to 1994. But they weren't property addresses. They were offshore account routing numbers. They were records of gold bullion purchases, and tucked into the very back page of the ledger was a single folded piece of thick parchment paper. I unfolded it carefully. It was an official certificate of authenticity for a Patek Philippe Grand Complication watch, a timepiece worth easily $500,000 on its own. The certificate listed the storage location: Wells Fargo, main branch, Vault 704. I looked from the ledger to the brass key resting in the foam. BX-704. I hadn't just bought a locker full of garbage. I had just bought the missing map to Harrison Whitmore's hidden empire. And the 6 canisters of undeveloped films sitting next to that key. I had a terrifying, sinking feeling they contained the evidence of why he really disappeared. I quickly slammed the lid of the Pelican case shut. I looked around the desolate storage facility. Suddenly, the silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt dangerous. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. If Whitmore was really gone, who had been paying the rent on this unit for the last 5 years? And why did they suddenly stop? I grabbed the heavy case by the handle, hauled it out of the unit, and shoved it behind the driver's seat of my truck, throwing a dirty jacket over it. I had $34 in my bank account. I was officially homeless, but holding that key in my pocket, I knew my life was never going to be the same. I just didn't know yet if that was a blessing or a death sentence. I spent the second night in my Ford Ranger, parked behind a dilapidated strip mall off Olive Drive, shivering as the temperature plummeted. I had the Pelican case shoved beneath a pile of old blankets on the floorboard, my hand resting on the hard plastic shell all night. I didn't sleep a wink. Every passing set of headlights, every stray dog digging in the nearby dumpster, made my heart hammer against my ribs. By morning, I had a plan, but I needed capital. The $34.12 in my bank account wasn't going to cover professional film development, especially for decades-old sensitive 35mm film that required chemical processing. I drove to Pioneer Pawn on Chester Avenue. It hurt my pride, but I hauled my truck's heavy-duty hydraulic jack, my set of socket wrenches, and the brand-new steel-toe work boots I'd just bought for the warehouse into the shop. The guy behind the counter, a bald man chewing aggressively on a toothpick, gave me a flat $115 for the lot. It was highway robbery, but I didn't have the luxury of negotiation. Cash in hand, I searched my phone for an old-school photo lab. Digital had killed most of them, but I found a place called Golden Valley Camera and Film. It was wedged between a dry cleaner and a defunct Blockbuster Video that had been converted into a discount liquor store. The bell chimed as I walked in. The shop smelled strongly of acetic acid and old paper. Behind the counter stood an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a thick grey beard. His name tag read, Arthur. "I need these developed," I said, placing 2 of the 6 silver canisters on the glass counter. I decided to hold 4 back, just in case. And I need it done today. Rush job. I'll pay double. Arthur picked up one of the canisters, inspecting the seal. Ilford HP5, black and white. This film expired in 1998, son. The chemical degradation could be severe. I can push the processing, but I can't guarantee what you'll get. It'll take me at least 3 hours. Do it, I said, handing him an $80 bill. I'll wait. I spent those 3 hours sitting in my sweltering truck, gnawing on a stale protein bar I found in my glove compartment, staring at the entrance of the camera shop. My mind raced with the possibilities of what was on those negatives. If Harrison Whitmore had fled the country with millions in embezzled money, why leave behind a storage unit with a map to his assets? At exactly 1 p.m., I walked back into the shop. Arthur wasn't at the counter. I tapped the service bell. A moment later, Arthur emerged from the darkroom in the back. He didn't look like the friendly, mild-mannered shop owner from 3 hours ago. He looked pale. His hands were visibly shaking as he held a large manila envelope. He walked up to the counter, looked left and right out the front windows, and slid the envelope toward me. "I don't know where you found these, kid," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "And frankly, I don't want to know. I didn't make copies. I wiped the scanner. You take this, and you don't ever tell anyone you came in here." "What is it?" I asked, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. "Just look," he muttered. Stepping back from the counter, I opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of 8 by 10 glossy prints. They were grainy and high-contrast black and white, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from a distance. The first photo showed Harrison Whitmore standing on the tarmac of Meadows Field Airport in the dead of night. He was standing next to a sleek, twin-engine private jet. Beside him was a pallet stacked high with heavy wooden crates. I flipped to the second photo. The camera had zoomed in on one of the crates. One of the wooden slats was broken, revealing the dull, unmistakable gleam of stacked gold bullion. But it was the third photo that made the breath leave my lungs. Whitmore wasn't alone on the tarmac. Standing next to him, shaking his hand and taking a thick leather briefcase from him, was a younger, slightly thinner man. Even with the grainy quality of the 90s film, the man's face was unmistakable. It was Thomas Sterling. My hands began to tremble. Thomas Sterling wasn't just a local name. He was the current sitting city councilman, the reigning king of Bakersfield real estate, and the man who had bought up all of Whitmore's foreclosed properties for pennies on the dollar after the FBI raids. Sterling owned the local media. He had the police chief in his pocket. The official story was that Sterling was a white knight who saved the local economy when Whitmore's criminal empire collapsed. These photos told a completely different story. Sterling hadn't saved the city from Whitmore. He had conspired with him. Sterling had helped him smuggle the gold out of the country, likely taking a massive cut, and then orchestrated the hostile takeover of the remaining real estate. "Arthur," I whispered, staring at the damning evidence of a multi-million-dollar political conspiracy. "Did you—" "I didn't see anything," Arthur interrupted sharply, his eyes wide with genuine fear. "People in this town who cross Thomas Sterling end up finding the bottom of the Kern River. Take your photos and go." I shoved the prints back into the envelope, tucked it under my jacket, and hurried out of the shop. The California sun hit me like a physical blow. As I walked to my truck, I glanced across the street. Parked in the lot of a defunct gas station was a black, heavily tinted Chevy Tahoe. It hadn't been there when I went inside. As I unlocked my Ranger, the Tahoe's engine roared to life. It didn't pull out into traffic. It just idled, its dark windshield pointed directly at me. I was officially in the crosshairs. The storage unit auction hadn't just given me a map to a treasure. It had handed me a loaded gun pointed directly at the most powerful man in the city. Panic is a strange fuel. It sharpens your senses while simultaneously making you feel like you're walking underwater. I peeled out of the parking lot, aggressively cutting through alleyways and running 2 yellow lights until I was sure the black Tahoe wasn't in my rearview mirror. I parked behind an abandoned strip mall and locked the doors. I needed to get to that Wells Fargo safe deposit box before whoever was looking for this stuff realized someone had breached the storage unit. But I had a massive problem. I couldn't just walk into a bank vault looking like a vagrant, smelling of sweat and despair, holding a key that belonged to a missing fugitive. I needed an alias. I grabbed the olive green Pelican case and opened it on the passenger seat. I carefully removed the Leica camera, the film canisters, and the ledger. I began pressing my fingers against the dense black foam lining the bottom. If Whitmore was paranoid enough to build this case, maybe he hid something else. My thumb caught on a nearly invisible seam in the corner. I dug my fingernails in and ripped the foam upward. It was a false bottom. Underneath the foam lay a flat, waterproof document pouch and 2 thick stacks of currency held together by rubber bands. I gasped. They were $100 bills, crisp, uncirculated Benjamins. I didn't have time to count it all, but it had to be at least $10,000. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the document pouch. Inside, there was no fake passport or ID like I had hoped. Instead, there was a stack of official, notarized legal documents. They were the articles of incorporation for a company called Apex Horizon Holdings, LLC. I flipped through the pages. The LLC was a bearer company registered in Delaware. and attached to the back was a legally binding, signed proxy authorization form. The line for the proxy representative's name was completely blank. Beside it sat a heavy, embossed corporate seal. Whitmore hadn't registered the safe deposit box in his own name. He had registered it under the shell company. Whoever possessed the corporate seal and the proxy form was legally authorized to access the assets of Apex Horizon Holdings. I pulled a pen from my glove box and, with shaking hands, wrote Caleb Hayes on the blank proxy line. I now had the legal right to open box 704, but I still looked like a guy who slept in a dumpster. I took $500 from the stack of cash and drove straight to a Men's Warehouse on Ming Avenue. I walked in, ignoring the judgmental stares of the sales associates, and bought a sharply tailored navy blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and a conservative silk tie. Next, I went to a barbershop down the street, paid $20 for a clean shave and a tight haircut, and washed my face in their sink. When I looked in the mirror, the desperate, heartbroken warehouse worker, whose fiancée had kicked him out, was gone. Staring back at me was a cold, sharp proxy representative for a multi-million-dollar holding company. At 3:30 p.m., I parked 2 blocks away from the Wells Fargo main branch on Truxton Avenue. It was a massive, imposing building with towering glass windows and marble columns. I took a deep breath, grabbed my leather portfolio containing the documents and the brass key, and walked through the sliding glass doors. The blast of air conditioning was freezing. I approached the front desk, where a polished woman in a grey suit smiled professionally. "How can I help you today, sir?" "I need to access a safe deposit box on behalf of a corporate client," I said, my voice shockingly steady. "Box 704, under Apex Horizon Holdings." "Of course, let me get the vault manager for you." A few minutes later, a tall, severe-looking man named Mr. Caldwell approached. He led me past the teller lines and down a carpeted hallway to a heavy, stainless steel vault door. "I'll need your ID and the corporate authorization, please," Caldwell said, his tone entirely strictly business. I handed him my California driver's license and the proxy form. I held my breath. If he scrutinized the ink, if he checked the dates too closely, or if there was a system alert on this specific box, I was walking out of here in handcuffs. Caldwell scanned the document, compared my ID, and typed something into his tablet. The silence stretched for an agonizing 30 seconds. "Very well, Mr. Hayes," Caldwell finally said. "Do you have the key?" I pulled the heavy brass key stamped with BX704 from my pocket. Caldwell nodded, inserted his master key into the upper slot of a long metallic wall of boxes, and gestured for me to insert mine. We turned them simultaneously. With a heavy clack, the door swung open. Inside was a long, deep steel metal cassette. "I'll give you privacy," Caldwell said, gesturing to a small, windowless viewing room across the hall. "Take all the time you need." I carried the heavy steel box into the room, set it on the mahogany table, and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely lift the latch on the cassette. I flipped the lid back. The box wasn't filled with gold or cash. Sitting on top was the wooden presentation box for the Patek Philippe watch mentioned in the ledger. I opened it, and there it was, a masterpiece of gold and sapphire crystal, ticking silently. A timepiece worth $500,000. Beneath the watch was a thick stack of bearer bonds, each printed with denominations of $100,000. There were dozens of them, but it was the item at the very bottom of the box that commanded my attention. It was a standard black USB flash drive sitting on top of a single folded piece of thick stationery. I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was frantic, completely different from the neat columns in the ledger. "If you are reading this, I am already dead. Thomas Sterling didn't just help me move the assets. He blackmailed me, drained the secondary accounts, and tipped off the feds to seize the rest. The drive in this box contains the audio recordings of Sterling ordering the hit on the federal prosecutor in '97 and the wire transfers proving he funded it. He thinks he won. Burn him to the ground." I stared at the letter, the air evaporating from my lungs. I hadn't just found a treasure. I had found the nuclear launch codes to destroy the most powerful man in the state. Suddenly, the harsh silence of the vault room was shattered by a sharp, vibrating buzz. It was my cell phone. I pulled it out. The caller ID read, "Unknown caller." I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen, before hitting accept and lifting it to my ear. "Hello," I whispered. "You clean up nice, Caleb," a cold, smooth voice said through the speaker. "The navy suit is a good look, much better than the warehouse uniform." My blood ran like ice water. I spun around, looking at the blank walls of the viewing room. "Who is this?" I demanded. "A friend who is very disappointed in Stan for renting out property that didn't belong to him," the voice replied calmly. "You're holding property that belongs to Mr. Sterling. You have exactly two options, Caleb. You can walk out of that bank, get into the black Tahoe waiting at the curb, and hand over the drive. Or we can pay a visit to a lovely young woman named Anna at her new apartment on Elm Street. Her new boyfriend Derek won't be able to help her." The phone clicked dead. I stood in the vault, trapped in a multi-million-dollar tomb. I had the money, I had the evidence, but the hunters were already at the door. The heavy steel walls of the viewing room seemed to close in on me, pressing the oxygen out of the air. The dead tone of the disconnected phone call echoed in my ear. They were at the bank, and they knew about Anna. I hated Anna. I hated Derek. Less than 48 hours ago, they had systematically dismantled my life, stolen my savings, and thrown me into the gutter like trash. A dark, vengeful part of my brain whispered that I should just walk away. Let Thomas Sterling's goons kick down the door of that apartment. Let Derek deal with the consequences of sleeping with another man's fiancée. But I wasn't a murderer. And if the letter in the safe deposit box was true, Thomas Sterling absolutely was. My hands flew over the mahogany table. I grabbed the stack of bearer bonds, 50 of them, each printed with a staggering $100,000 denomination. $5 million in untraceable liquid assets. I shoved them into the waterproof document pouch, followed by the heavy wooden box containing the Patek Philippe watch. Finally, I picked up the black USB flash drive. This wasn't just a piece of plastic, it was a stick of dynamite. I slipped it securely into the breast pocket of my new suit jacket. I pulled out my cell phone, my thumb shaking violently as I scrolled through my contacts. I hit Anna's name. It rang 3 times before she picked up. "Caleb, I swear to God, if you are calling to harass me about the apartment..." "Shut up and listen to me, Anna," I barked. My voice was a low, ragged growl that I didn't even recognize. It stopped her dead in her tracks. "Are you at the apartment right now?" "Yes, but..." "Is Derek there?" "He's in the shower." "Caleb, you are crossing a line. I am going to call the police." "Anna, listen to my voice," I interrupted, injecting every ounce of terror I was currently feeling into my words. I stumbled into something at a storage auction. Something big, and very, very dangerous people are looking for it. They just called me. They know where you live. They know Derek is there, and they are using you as leverage to get to me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Is this a joke? Because it's not funny." "Get out of the apartment, right now," I pleaded, my chest tight. "Don't pack a bag. Don't wait for Derek to finish his shower. Grab your car keys, walk out the door, and drive to your sister's house in Fresno. Do not go back to work. Do not answer the door." "Caleb," her voice finally wavered, the annoyance cracking to reveal a sliver of genuine fear. "Go, Anna! Now!" I hung up the phone and shoved it into my pocket. I had done all I could do. Now I had to save myself. I unlocked the door to the viewing room and stepped back out into the vault hallway. Mr. Caldwell, the severe vault manager, was waiting patiently near the steel gate. I forced my breathing to slow, channeling the cold, corporate proxy I had pretended to be 20 minutes ago. "Everything satisfactory, Mr. Hayes?" Caldwell asked, his eyes briefly flicking to my slightly bulging leather portfolio. "Perfectly fine, Mr. Caldwell," I said, forcing a tight, professional smile. However, I have a slight security concern. As a representative of Apex Horizon, I am carrying highly sensitive corporate assets. I noticed an aggressive-looking vehicle tailing my Uber on the way here. For my own safety, does this branch have a secure rear exit? Perhaps an employee departure door? Caldwell frowned, his professional demeanor tightening. Banks hate security risks. We do not typically allow non-personnel into the rear corridor, sir. But given your corporate tier, I can escort you to the alleyway door. It opens directly onto 18th Street. I would greatly appreciate that, I said, relief washing over me like a cold wave. Caldwell led me past the teller lines, through a heavy security door requiring his badge, and down a beige, fluorescent-lit hallway. We passed a break room smelling of burnt coffee and finally reached a heavy steel fire door. "Stay safe, Mr. Hayes," Caldwell said, swiping his badge. The door clicked open. I stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun of the alleyway. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind me, locking automatically. I didn't walk, I sprinted. I ran down the alley, my new leather dress shoes slapping loudly against the asphalt. I kept my head down, weaving past dumpsters and delivery trucks. When I reached the corner of 18th and I Street, I peeked around the brick facade. 2 blocks down, parked directly in front of the main entrance of Wells Fargo, was the black Chevy Tahoe. The passenger door was open. A man in a dark windbreaker was standing on the curb, his hand resting near his waistband, staring intently at the bank's glass doors. They were waiting for me to walk out. They had no idea I was already gone. I hugged the building line, moving swiftly in the opposite direction. I reached my beat-up Ford Ranger parked near the county library. I threw the portfolio onto the passenger seat, jammed the key into the ignition, and prayed the old engine would turn over. It sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life. I didn't take the main roads. I navigated the labyrinth of residential backstreets, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I hit Interstate 5, pushing the Ranger to 80 miles an hour, heading south toward Los Angeles. I was out of the trap, but I was officially a hunted man. I drove for 2 hours, the adrenaline slowly giving way to a bone-deep, trembling exhaustion. I crossed the treacherous mountain pass known as the Grapevine as the sun began to set, painting the California sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. I finally pulled off the highway in Santa Clarita, finding a cheap neon-lit motel that accepted cash and didn't ask for ID. I carried the Pelican case and my leather portfolio into the cramped, stale-smelling room. I locked the deadbolt, fastened the chain, and pulled the blackout curtains tightly shut. My first priority was intelligence. I needed to know exactly what was on that drive. I left the room just long enough to walk to a nearby big-box electronics store. I used the cash from the Pelican case's false bottom to buy a mid-range laptop, a prepaid internet hotspot, and 3 brand-new USB thumb drives. Back in the motel room, I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress and booted up the laptop. I took a deep breath, pulled the black USB drive from my suit pocket, and plugged it in. A single folder popped up on the screen. It was labeled simply, Insurance. Inside were a dozen digitized audio files and a folder of scanned PDF documents. I opened the PDFs first. They were wire transfer receipts from a Swiss bank account, routed through a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, directly into an account registered to a known associate of the Juarez cartel. The amounts were staggering. $250,000 here, $400,000 there. All of them bore the digital signature authorization of Thomas Sterling, but the audio files were the real nightmare. I clicked on the first one, dated October 14th, 1997. Static hissed through the laptop speakers, followed by the clinking of glassware. Then, 2 voices spoke. I immediately recognized the smooth, authoritative cadence of Thomas Sterling, albeit younger. "The federal prosecutor is pushing the subpoenas, Harrison," Sterling's voice echoed in the quiet motel room. "Moore isn't taking the bribes. He's a Boy Scout. If he gets access to the Apex Horizon ledgers, we both go down for RICO. Then came a deeper, gravelly voice. Harrison Whitmore. So we delay him, tie it up in motions. Motions won't stop a grand jury, Sterling replied, his tone chillingly casual. I've spoken to our friends across the border, 250,000. Moore has a cabin in Tahoe. He goes there alone on weekends. A gas leak, a spark, a tragic accident. Are we aligned on this, Harrison? There was a long silence on the tape. Do it, Whitmore finally said. I slammed my hand down on the spacebar, stopping the audio. My stomach violently churned. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Moore had died in a horrific cabin fire in Tahoe in the late 90s. I remembered reading about it in the local archives. It was ruled a tragic accident due to a faulty propane heater. I was holding undeniable proof of the assassination of a federal official. Thomas Sterling wasn't just a corrupt politician. He was a murderer who had bought an entire city with blood money. And now he knew I had the evidence. The local police were useless. If I walked into the Bakersfield PD with this, I'd likely be arrested on trumped-up charges, and the drive would vanish into an evidence locker, never to be seen again. I needed a bigger hammer. I needed the federal government, and I needed the press. But most importantly, I needed leverage to keep myself breathing. I spent the next 3 hours copying the contents of the insurance folder onto the 3 blank thumb drives I had bought. Then, I connected to the prepaid hotspot and created a secure, encrypted email account through Proton Mail. I drafted a single, terrifyingly clear message. Attached is evidence of the 1997 assassination of federal prosecutor David Moore, ordered by Councilman Thomas Sterling and funded by Harrison Whitmore. If you are receiving this, something has happened to me. I attached the audio files and the PDF wire transfers. I set up a delayed send, a dead man's switch. The email was scheduled to automatically dispatch in exactly 24 hours to the tip lines of the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the FBI field office in Los Angeles, and the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. The only way to stop the email from sending was if I manually logged in tomorrow and delayed the timer. If Sterling's men killed me or took me captive, the timer would run out, and Thomas Sterling's entire empire would burn to ashes. I had my shield. Now it was time to forge a sword. I took the burner phone out of its plastic packaging, dialed the unknown caller number that had rung me in the vault, and pressed it to my ear. It rang twice before the smooth, cold voice answered. Well, you're a slippery one, Caleb. I commend your quick thinking at the bank. But you can't run forever. We already paid a visit to your lovely fiancé's apartment. Shame she wasn't home. My jaw clenched. Anna had listened. She had gotten out. I'm not running, I said, my voice steady, completely devoid of the panic I had felt earlier that day. I've listened to the tapes. I know about Prosecutor Moore. A heavy silence fell over the line. When the voice returned, the amusement was entirely gone. Then you know what happens next. I know that if anything happens to me or to Anna, an encrypted server is going to automatically send those tapes and the Swiss wire transfers to the LA Times and the FBI. I lied smoothly, omitting that it was just a simple delayed email. It's a dead man's switch. You kill me, you kill Thomas Sterling. Checkmate. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. I had them. What do you want, Caleb? I want a meeting, I demanded, looking at the $5 million in bearer bonds sitting on the motel bed. Face to face, with Thomas Sterling, tomorrow at noon, or I let the clock run out. I didn't sleep a single second that night. I sat in the dim glow of the cheap motel lamp, staring at the $5 million in bearer bonds and the Patek Philippe watch. I had the money to disappear forever, but Thomas Sterling was a man who owned judges, police chiefs, and politicians. If I just ran, I would spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. He would never stop hunting me. He couldn't afford to. By 9 a.m., I formulated my endgame. I took the original black USB drive, the bearer bonds, and the watch, and placed them securely inside the Pelican case. I drove to a UPS store 2 towns over in Valencia, rented a private anonymous mailbox under the Apex Horizon proxy name, and locked the case inside. If I didn't survive the afternoon, Sterling still wouldn't get his hands on the assets. All I kept on my person was a single copied thumb drive and my newly purchased burner phone. The meeting was set for noon at the epicenter of Sterling's power. The top floor of the Sterling Enterprises high-rise in downtown Bakersfield. Walking into that glass and steel lobby was the hardest thing I've ever done. My heart hammered against my ribs, but the bespoke navy suit acted like armor. I approached the security desk, gave my name, and was immediately escorted by 2 massive stone-faced men in dark suits to a private elevator. We rode up in silence. The doors opened to a sprawling, immaculate penthouse office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city. Sitting behind a massive mahogany desk was Thomas Sterling. He was in his late 60s, with perfectly styled silver hair, a custom-tailored charcoal suit, and the kind of aggressive, practiced smile that politicians use to hide their teeth. Standing in the corner was the man in the dark windbreaker who had been waiting for me outside the bank. "Mr. Hayes," Sterling said, steepling his fingers. His voice was just as smooth and cold as it had been on the phone. "Please, have a seat. Would you like a drink? Water? Macallan?" "I'm fine," I said, remaining standing. I dropped the plastic thumb drive onto his pristine desk. It landed with a hollow clack. Sterling didn't even look at it. "I must admit, Caleb, I'm impressed. A warehouse grunt gets dumped by his cheating fiancée, buys a blind storage unit with his last $30, and suddenly thinks he can play in the major leagues. It's a great American underdog story. But underdog stories usually end with the protagonist in a shallow grave. I don't want to play in your league, Sterling," I said, keeping my voice dead level. "I just want to be left alone." "You took $5 million in bearer bonds that belonged to me," Sterling countered, his smile vanishing, replaced by a terrifying reptilian coldness. Harrison Whitmore was an idiot who thought he could outsmart me. When he realized he couldn't, he hid the safety deposit key in that locker. I've had men looking for that key for 5 years, and you just stumbled onto it. "And the audio recordings?" I asked. "The ones where you order the murder of a federal prosecutor. Did those belong to you too?" Sterling leaned back, sighing. "You're a smart kid, so you know that I can't just let you walk out of here. Dead man's switch or not, if I let you leave with my money and those copies, you own me forever. I don't do partners, Caleb." "I don't want to be your partner," I said, pulling my burner phone from my pocket and placing it on the desk next to the drive. "I want to be a ghost. You get the drive and you call off your dogs. I keep the bonds as my severance package. We never see each other again." The man in the windbreaker shifted his weight in the corner, his hand dropping toward his waist. Sterling raised a single finger, stopping him. "And the dead man's switch?" Sterling asked, his eyes narrowing. "The emails scheduled to go to the FBI and the LA Times?" "I cancel them right here, right now, in front of you," I said. "Once I log in and terminate the countdown, we're done." Sterling stared at me for a long, agonizing minute. He was calculating the odds. He knew I was terrified, but he also knew the evidence on that drive would guarantee him a lethal injection if it ever saw the light of day. $5 million was a fraction of his net worth. It was a cheap price to pay for his life. "Log in," Sterling finally commanded. "Cancel the emails, and then my associate is going to escort you out of the city. If I ever see your face in California again, the dead man's switch won't save you." I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't open the Proton Mail app. I looked up at Sterling, and for the first time since my fiancée had kicked me out into the rain, I smiled. A genuine, unrestrained smile. "There's just one problem, Tom," I said softly. Sterling's brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" "I lied," I said. "I didn't set the dead man's switch for 24 hours. I tapped the screen, waking up the phone, and turned it around so Sterling could see the digital clock. It read exactly 12:02 p.m. I set it for noon, I whispered. The silence in the penthouse office was so absolute, so suffocating, that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Thomas Sterling stared at the digital clock on my phone, his mind struggling to process what I had just said. "You set it for noon," Sterling repeated, his voice losing its polished veneer, cracking slightly. "2 minutes ago," I confirmed, taking a slow step backward toward the heavy oak doors. "While you were monologuing about shallow graves, an encrypted server in Switzerland sent the audio files and the Swiss wire transfers to the tip lines of the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the direct inbox of the FBI field office in Los Angeles. The subject line was, 'The Murder of David Moore.'" "Grab him!" Sterling roared, surging to his feet, his chair toppling backward. The man in the windbreaker lunged toward me, drawing a suppressed pistol from his waistband. But before he could raise the barrel, the sharp, shrill ring of the sleek multi-line telephone on Sterling's desk shattered the air. Then, Sterling's personal cell phone began to ring. Then, the windbreaker guy's radio crackled to life with panicked, overlapping voices from the ground floor security team. Sterling froze, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. He slowly reached down and picked up the receiver of his desk phone. He didn't speak. He just listened. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving him looking like a pale, hollowed-out corpse. The media didn't need time to verify a tape that explosive, especially when it was backed by flawless Swiss banking wire transfers. The fire had been lit, and the explosion was instantaneous. "Sir," the man with the gun said, his voice wavering, looking at his boss for a command. "Put it down, Rollins," Sterling whispered, dropping the phone receiver. It dangled off the edge of the desk, a tiny voice squawking from the earpiece. "It's over. The FBI. They're already in the lobby." I didn't wait to see the rest of the collapse. I turned around, pushed open the heavy oak doors, and walked out into the hallway. The executive assistants were running around in absolute chaos, answering ringing phones and staring at their computer monitors in horror. I walked past them, slipped into the stairwell, and began my descent. By the time I reached the ground floor and exited through a side fire door, the street was a sea of flashing red and blue lights. 4 black-armored FBI Suburbans had jumped the curb, and heavily armed agents in tactical gear were flooding into the glass lobby of Sterling Enterprises. News vans were already screeching around the corner, satellite dishes extending from their roofs. Thomas Sterling's empire of blood and concrete had just fallen, and I was the ghost who pulled the final brick. I kept my head down, blended into the growing crowd of onlookers, and walked away. 2 days later, I sat in the sun-drenched courtyard of a cafe in Santa Barbara, sipping a black coffee that tasted infinitely better than the one at Denny's. The front page of the newspaper sitting on my table featured a massive full-color photo of Thomas Sterling being led out of his building in handcuffs. The headline read, "City Councilman Arrested in Decades-Old Assassination Plot." As for Anna and Derek, I heard through a mutual friend that Derek worked for one of Sterling's subsidiary real estate firms. When the feds froze all of Sterling's assets, Derek's firm went under overnight. He lost his job, and a week later, he dumped Anna because she couldn't afford the rent on the apartment by herself. She had tried calling me 3 times. I blocked her number. I finished my coffee, picked up the heavy Pelican case sitting next to my chair, and walked down to the marina. I had a meeting with an offshore broker to quietly liquidate the $5 million in bearer bonds. I was 30 years old. I had a $500,000 Patek Philippe ticking on my wrist, and a brand new life ahead of me. And to think, it all started with a broken heart, a wet alleyway, and a $30 gamble on a locker full of garbage. What an absolute roller coaster. From sleeping in a freezing Ford Ranger to holding $5 million in untraceable bonds and taking down a corrupt, murderous politician. Caleb's story proves that sometimes hitting absolute rock bottom is the exact push you need to take the biggest, most life-changing risk of your life. He didn't just find a hidden treasure. He found justice for a man who was silenced decades ago. and he completely outsmarted a billionaire in the process. If this incredible true story treasure hunt had you on the edge of your seat, do me a massive favor and smash that like button right now. It tells the algorithm you want more crazy hidden treasure stories just like this one. Share this video with a friend who loves a good revenge story, and make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below. If you found that vault key, would you have taken the money and run, or would you have stayed to take down Thomas Sterling? Let me know, and I'll see you in the next video.